In this video, we're going to be discussing the politics of Birth of a Nation and how Griffith stages this film to attempt to draw the viewer into his version of history. We're going to see how cinematography and editing play into this, but also how he shapes his story by interweaving historical moments into this fictional plot. And we're going to start by looking at some of the text disclaimers that he introduces his film with. Griffith knows that his film is going to be provocative and offensive to many people, but he also knows that it's going to touch a nerve with many white Americans who are going to see it at the time. And because the American population, particularly the white American population, both in the North and South, is struggling to adjust with the prospects of racial equality. And so this film emerges at a very tense time. Griffith's statement reads, "We do not fear censorship, for we have no wish to offend with improprieties or obscenities, but we do demand, as a right, the liberty to show the dark side of wrong, that we may illuminate the bright side of virtue, the same liberty that is conceded to the art of the written word, that art to which we owe the Bible and the works of Shakespeare." Griffith is making some pretty big claims here. He's saying he doesn't intend to offend anyone. But of course, even making this statement admits with full knowledge that this is going to be an offensive and divisive film. He's stating his rights to his freedoms of speech, where of course this film actually argues for the curtailing of rights and freedoms of African Americans, so it's a bit ironic of a statement. And he grandly compares his film to the Bible and to the works of Shakespeare, both in terms of saying that these are controversial texts, but that also they are seen to be artistically valuable and have great truths embedded inside them. So Griffith is really touting himself here and also trying to force blame away from him in full knowledge that this is going to be a film that catalyzes a lot of powerful and negative emotions in those who view it. Let's look at the next disclaimer that follows. This one's also interesting because it's similar to one we see in films nowadays that say something to the effect of any similarities between characters in this film and real persons are purely accidental. This film comments in no way on the lives of particular people living or dead. Now this says something different, but we see Griffith hedging here. This disclaimer reads, "This is a historical presentation of the Civil War and Reconstruction period, and this is not meant to reflect on any race or people today." This is a bit hard to swallow. The American Civil War was fought in the early 1860s, so just about 50 years before this film came out, and Reconstruction goes on for another 10 years or so. So this film is set within the lifetimes of people who are watching it or of their parents. And so it's not in the distant past. This is not a far memory. It's hitting upon still raw nerves for lots of people in the audience, both white and black. And certainly Griffith is claiming that it's not his intention to reflect on people or races today. But certainly that was the effect of the film. And I think we can say with good knowledge that Griffith did expect this. Birth of a Nation tells the story of two intertwined families, a Southern family, the Camerons, and a Northern family, the Stonemans, during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. And I'll get more into this in a bit. But it also tells a larger story, which unfortunately Griffith thought was true, that the Civil War and Reconstruction period caused a situation in America that could only be righted with the creation of the Ku Klux Klan and resegregation of the country, if not actually the return of African Americans to Africa. As Griffith had it, only by restoring white supremacy through intimidation, harassment, and violence, and by eliminating, this was particularly important to him in the film, miscegenation, could peace be restored on Earth. The plotline is obviously quite upsetting, and the effects of the film were even more so, I think. It seems hard to imagine that a movie like this could be so successful, especially amongst all the protests and bannings that followed it. But there are a few things to keep in mind to explain why this was so popular. Not only does controversy stoke interest, and when something is sensational. People do flock to see it. But that in 1915, when this film came out, the United States was experiencing a backlash against progress toward racial equality. And that even calls into question whether any racial equality really followed after the Emancipation Proclamation and during the Reconstruction period. Black Americans were being disenfranchised in the South. They were being prevented from voting in all sorts of ways. And Jim Crow laws had just been recently instituted all across the South. And it wasn't until the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement that some of these laws and behaviors were remedied, and then only partially, and often with a huge amount of resentment and resistance. And of course, changing laws, both in the Reconstruction period and in the Civil Rights era, and even today, doesn't mean that people change their behaviors and their racism. Individual, cultural, or structural racism still existed and didn't really go away. And this wasn't just the case for the South. In the North, this was a really tense time as well in the teens. There was a huge influx of African Americans coming from the South to the North. And there was concern that this would change economic relations, that African Americans would take jobs from white Americans. And so I'm sure you can hear even echoes of these kinds of debates happening in our contemporary moment around immigration. So it was a really fraught time across the whole country, and it certainly wasn't just in the South that this film found an audience and support. To stress how this film did in fact have broad and maybe even unexpected support, we can turn to thinking about President Woodrow Wilson, who was in office when the film came out. One of the many quotations put up on the screen during this film comes from the president himself. In this little excerpt, which comes from Wilson's History of the American People, he writes, "Adventurers swarmed out of the North, as much the enemies of one race as the other, to cozen, beguile, and use the Negroes. In the villages, the Negroes were the office holders, men who knew none of the uses of authority except for its insolences." And it continues, "The policy of the congressional leaders wrought a veritable overthrow of civilization in the South in their determination to put the white South under the heel of the black South. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country." And signed here, Woodrow Wilson. So the sitting president's words are used to support the politics that the film is putting forward. And President Wilson wasn't only a fan of the film, but there was actually a special screening of this film at the White House. It was the very first film screened in the White House. And Wilson, it seems, accepted the film as truthful and factual. He was an old college friend of Thomas Dixon, who was the author of the book The Klansman that the film is based on. And Wilson's own work, of course, is quoted here to support the argument that Griffith is making. So he's drawing upon the sentiments and even the votes and support of Americans at the time to give credence to the argument that he's making here for the South and for this racist and racialized revolution. It should be clear that in Birth of a Nation, Griffith isn't just telling a story, but he's making an argument, and these kinds of textual supports and citations only strengthen both that argument and the didactic nature of the film itself. And the argument he's making is a pretty clear one. If you've watched the whole film, it's pretty hard to miss it. And I think, or I hope, it's hard to be seduced by it in our day and age. But we have to imagine that given the political and cultural climate of the United States in 1915, there were people who were swept along. And it might be hard to understand how this could happen. How could a fictional story persuade viewers into embracing a really loathsome political position. This is a testament to Griffith's skill in making an engrossing and spectacular film, and one that used really high artistry for the time. But it also has to do with the way that Griffith manipulates and alters history and fits historical moments really well into his fictional narrative. And it has to do with the ways that we tend to watch films. We often let ourselves get swept along in a story, and many times we don't actually engage our critical faculties while we're watching a film. Now, the politics in this film are pretty heavy-handed. Especially from the perspective of our contemporary moment, but they might not have been quite so clear for viewers at the time, who didn't have too much historical distance, as we were just saying, from the moments that Griffith was portraying. And as a director, he was very skillful at making the audience identify with his main characters, who are all white and all portrayed as noble, and that have fallen unfairly on hard economic times since they lost their slaves, and their livelihoods are destroyed. And so he tries to create and cultivate a lot of empathy for these characters. And we're going to talk about how that happens through editing and through these kinds of point of view shots that we introduced just a few videos ago. As we're going to see, this editing was really important for doing this for Griffith and how he took hold of his audience. And it's important for us to realize that films are always making arguments. It's not just one that has a rather direct political agenda like this one that does so. And sometimes we're just not really paying attention. As I said, we get swept along. We're engrossed in a story, or we identify with certain moments of it. We might go see, for instance, a tearjerker romantic film and think that it's just a story. But that story always has a point or an ideology or a set of normative conventions at its base that we sometimes accept rather unquestionably. And these assumptions might not be as oppressive as the ones that Griffith hopes to play upon, but we can think that how there isn't a happy ending unless someone finds love or has a baby or comes into a lot of money or whatever it is, that we don't feel like stories are done unless everyone comes out with those kind of normative goals that we're told culturally in our society make us happy. Lots of films have it so that teenagers need to lose their virginity by prom night, or there's always clear-cut good and bad guys. And the politics of our world are never black and white like that, and happiness never rests on just one simple metric. And so we have films that reinscribe and reinforce assumptions about our culture, which we might not actually even have ourselves, but we see them play out so often, and we are led into identification with these characters that they can seem quite natural. And they're natural because they are dominant assumptions in our culture, but they are in fact still arguments. Watch any sci-fi or horror film and you're going to find a pretty strong argument, whether it's about pollution or weather disaster films like The Day After Tomorrow, and horror films like Godzilla, which you're looking at right here, usually have some fairly strong message. Godzilla is about the fallout of war, literally the radioactive fallout of war in Japan. And many films of the 1950s, horror films, were thinly veiled explorations of fears of communism, Invasion of the Body Snatchers being one such example. So in almost every film, we see an argument being made, but we might be so captivated by the story itself that we forget to be critical, though we are ingesting the politics and the narrative that are being given to us in these films. We could take, for example, Avatar from 2009 as a good example of this, and perhaps many of you have seen this film. When it came out, it struck me that this film was a lot like Birth of a Nation, at least in the way that it was being discussed. It was the most expensive film that had ever been made at the time, the most technologically sophisticated. It was the highest grossing film ever. Tickets to see this film actually cost more than other films at that same theater. So we can hear a lot of echoes of that kind of economic or social discourse that surrounded Birth of a Nation. It, of course, didn't have the same political discussions surrounding it, but these economic bits of information made it sensational. And rather than discouraging attendance because it was more expensive, it became something to be seen. It was a spectacle. It became part of our contemporary conversation about film and culture in general. And it touches upon a lot of issues that were important to the present day: colonialization, race relationships, and also new technologies, unmanned avatar-like robots that these characters drive, which of course this is happening at the same time that drone warfare is coming about. The plot is pretty troubling, though. We have Americans or Earthlings being positioned as a colonializing force, and the main character of the film, of course, breaks with this colonial practice, but we still get into that rather troubling trope of American storytelling and film in which a white man goes into a native or foreign population and quickly shows that he's better at everything they do and becomes some sort of king or hero to that indigenous population almost immediately. And sometimes we don't even notice these parts of the story because we're so engulfed in the fantasy of the film. And indeed, this is part of what's so powerful and dangerous about film in general, and helps us understand how Birth of a Nation had the effects that it did and why it's still so important to think about it today. Because of how dazzling this film was at the time, it was surprisingly easy to watch despite its content and its very long length. Remember, this was a 3-hour film for people who were used to watching shorts. And while we might think that each shot drags on for quite a bit of time, this was actually very fast-paced editing for its moment. So even if the film appears to be dragging to you, this was quite dynamic for viewers at the time. And the seduction of this film for the period audience was alarming, in part because some of them probably weren't aware that what they were being shown was in fact historical fiction. Remember, the disclaimers that we looked at the beginning of the film states this as history. Griffith doesn't want it to reflect on people of the present, which of course is ridiculous, but that he's making a claim for this being true history. And as we already saw from the Woodrow Wilson quote, he's doing a lot to even academically shore up that interpretation. All of the moments of this film go towards supporting Griffith's opinion that white Southerners are unfailingly moral and genteel, whereas Northerners, and particularly African Americans, are corrupted by their race and their position in the country. And in particular, he shows people who are bi or multiracial as being very specifically risky figures in this film. And indeed, while so much of the discussion around the Civil War and Reconstruction is about slavery and states' rights, that being the states' rights to continue to have slavery as an institution, the real fear that Griffith is stoking in this film is about intermarriage. That seems to be all the danger here, that the whole reason Griffith seems to be pushing that there's a move toward equality is so that African American men can marry white women and therefore change the racial mixture of the United States. So this is a particularly pointed and strange argument for Griffith to be making, but this is the ideology and the fear that he is stoking in the film. To look at the plot of this film, you might take it as just a typical love story. It's about two families who are old friends, and eventually all the children seem to go on to be lovers. But they're split by war, and initially, at least, by ideology, but grow toward a Southern segregationist logic by the end of the film. The Camerons are from the South, and they make up the central characters of the film. And the Stonemans are from the North, and they play a more of a supporting role here. August Stoneman is one of the villains of the film. He's a Northern politician who both supports desegregation, but also the evil that he's aligned with is, of course, encouraging the intermingling of races, and his love interest in the film is a biracial character, which in Griffith's logic casts him as morally bankrupt. And he's portrayed in the film as unquestionably a villain and as vain. He has a wig. He's always concerned with his appearance. He's literally lame. He has a cane and one leg is longer than the other. And so he's shown as a less vital and kind of decrepit figure in the film. And this idea of the North and its corruption and its lameness is contrasted with the South, which is figured as just the best place ever, especially in the early moments of the film, where life runs, as the intertitle says, in a quaintly way. We see it as literally full of sleeping puppies and peacefulness. But this life, according to Griffith and the film's plot, is destroyed by the Emancipation Proclamation and by civil war, and then later wrought into ruin by Reconstruction. And it's true that plantation culture came under threat and eventually crumbled without the institution of slavery and the owning of human beings to support that industry. But we have Griffith pointing over and over again to this larger threat that equality would cause, which would put the white race and particularly white women in jeopardy. And so we see him playing upon this rather irrational fear about jeopardizing white women and whiteness in general. And of course, this is the logic that led to lynchings and all sorts of racial violence, not just in this period, but really for decades and decades and decades afterwards. At one moment of the film, Dr. Cameron is going to kill his own daughter, and she puts herself quite willingly forward for this, rather than to let her fall into the hands of the Union soldiers, which are portrayed as ravenous, rape-hungry devils, and of course are figured as black. And blackness here is almost always in blackface. So we have this racialized trope that happens in mise-en-scène throughout the film as well. By the end of the film, of course, the Klan prevails, saving these white women from the fates that Griffith sets up for them. And in the end, we're figured as this kind of return to peace toward earth, where we literally have the figure of Jesus Christ floating over this new nation, imagining a history that Griffith is moralizing here as being one that is for the good. The way that Griffith makes these arguments is worth paying close attention to. He, throughout the film, reenacts historical scenes based upon real events and which draw upon sources, academic and historical sources, which are cited and quoted in text frames to show us history being brought to life. And he does this primarily by giving us a quote or a set of historical dates, and then following that by what appears in its first moment to be something like a tableau vivant, all of these people holding still in an image, almost as if they're in a history painting. As we discussed earlier in this class, both photography and history painting were known to make claims about the truth and reality and how it's communicated to us. And Griffith is very carefully and very cannily drawing upon these traditions and tropes. In this particular scene, we see General Robert E. Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant. Now, these have not been major characters in the film, but we understand them as the necessary background to a story about the Civil War. We also get other events like Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. And again, we will see a quotation and a citation on screen, and then move into this almost still holding group of people in an image that then slowly wakes up into life as if a photograph or a painting is coming to life, animating the story that's on display for us here. So he reenacts critical moments in the history of the American Civil War and the Reconstruction era. And he supports these moments throughout with quotations from historians and from books, and even citing historical paintings. We saw this very early on with him citing Woodrow Wilson, the sitting American president. That's just one example of how he's trying to give a researched, citational, verified account of what he's claiming. He's already presenting a very biased and take on American history, but then he goes on to intensify this by inserting his characters into these historical reenactments. So having his imagined, invented characters interacting with these historical figures in similar ways as we've just seen. I'm going to have us watch now what is probably the most famous scene from this film, which is his reenactment of the assassination of President Lincoln at Ford's Theater. And this is really kind of an amazing scene because he inserts his characters directly into this historical moment. So we've just seen his characters, the Stoneman children, inserted into a historical event, and one that's portrayed very dramatically. I hope you noticed while watching it how Griffith combined lots of different shot distances, many cuts within this scene, to give us a sense of not just the placement of the Stonemans in the theater, their proximity to really dramatic history, but their witnessing of the event, right? Of them both looking at the stage and the reverse shot to them in the audience, and then, of course, seeing what happens in the balcony when the president is shot and when John Wilkes Booth jumps onto the stage. They are caught up in this terrifying moment in history. And Griffith doing this kind of blends together these two threads in his film. One that is all this historically researched and justified set of claims about the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, and then his fictional narrative too, and they come together, and it lends credence and truthfulness and veracity to the story that he's inventing around these characters, around their particular position within the Civil War, the events and their involvement with the KKK, the particular evil characters and heroes that he's creating. He's making these all historically justified and grounded characters as well. And him doing this not only lends credibility to the story that he's telling, that he's inventing, but it also then allows him to portray historical events in less and less accurate ways, as we'll see in this next clip. We can take, for example, this scene in which he shows the effects of enfranchisement of African American men and how it affected the political climate of the time. Now, it's true that after African Americans were given citizenship and men were allowed to vote, many African American politicians were elected into legislatures, especially on the state level. What we have here as being fully fictionalized is, of course, the disenfranchisement of white voters